Guten Abend miteinander. Good evening. I shall start by quoting two passages from the 4th chapter of the Declaration Nostra Aetate. The Church, therefore, cannot forget that she received the revelation of the Old Testament through the people with whom God, in His inexpressible mercy, concluded the ancient covenant. Nor can she forget that she draws sustenance from the root of that well-cultivated olive tree unto which have been grafted the wild shoots, the Gentiles. Unquote. And later on, the declaration continues, quote, as Holy Scripture testifies, Jerusalem did not recognize the time of her visitation, nor did the Jews in large number accept the gospel. Indeed, not a few opposed its spreading. Nevertheless, God holds the Jews most dear for the sake of their fathers. He does not repent of the gifts he makes or of the calls he issues. Unquote. Cardinal Kurt Koch, you are the former Bishop of Basel and you served as the president of the Swiss Episcopal Conference. Today you are the president of the Pontifical Council for Promoting Christian Unity and you are responsible for the Commission for Religious Relations with the Jews. The Declaration Nostra Aetate that was issued by the Catholic Church 50 years ago has brought about a fundamental change in the Christianic-Judaic relations. In the wake of the Second Vatican Council in 1965, we have been witnessing an unprecedented flourishing of Jewish-Christian relations on different institutional levels. And yet, I think the few words I quoted from the declaration before show what a complex endeavor it must have been to weave such different, even contradictory religious intuitions into a coherent theological position. Cardinal, what are the central messages of Nostra Aetate concerning the Jews, and how do you understand their religious significance for you as a Christian?
Thank you for the introduction and here some words of this declaration. It is very important, above all, the declaration remember the roots in the Christianity in the Jewish people, that we have a common patrimony and we must confess the unity between the Old and the New Testament. And we cannot forget the roots there are in the Jewish faith. And then is clear that in this declaration that anti-Semitism is against religion, is against the Christianity. And I think this was a very important step after a difficult history in the relations between Jewish people and Christianity, above all Catholic Church, and to see that the Jewish religion is not, as said John Paul II, is not extrinsic to the Christian faith, but is intrinsic. And in this sense, for us, the relation with the Jew people is not a sort of interreligious dialogue as the others, because the relation between the Christians and the Jewish people is particular. It's a particular dialogue. I think the Catholic theologian Eric Chevara has said once that the first split that we have in the history of Christianity is the split between synagogue and church. And in this sense, the reconciliation between Jewish people and Christians is very important, and Nostra Aetate is the fundamental basic for these new relations between the two religions.
Thank you. Rabbi David Rosen, you are the former chief rabbi of Ireland.
A long time ago.
And you also served as the rabbi of the largest South African congregation in Cape Town. Today you are in charge of the Interreligious Affairs of the American Jewish Council, AJC committee, and you are honorary president of the ICCJ, International Council of Christians and Jews. And you are also the honorary advisor on interreligious relations to the chief rabbinate in Israel. Rabbi, many Jews have never heard of Nostra Aetate, and some would say that it doesn't have to be of their concern what the Christians think of them. What is the significance and importance of Nostra Aetate for the Jewish people in your eyes?
So thank you very much. You also didn't mention the fact that I live in Jerusalem and have been in Jerusalem now for more than 30 years, from where I run around the world. So first of all, let me respond by saying that I want first of all to thank you all. That's what I wanted to first of all respond by thanking you all, because I feel not only am I grateful for the invitation to be able to be with you here today on this occasion, but I feel a little bit of a chutzpah that because of me, none of you are listening to this conversation in your native language. So that is an amazing gesture of kindness on your part, of all of you, and I thank you very much for that. So Gabi, getting back to your question, this relationship between the Catholic Church and the Jewish people was transformed by Nostra Aetate, is a revolution unparalleled in human history. There is nothing equivalent. Remember that for most of history, the Christian world, the Catholic Church, viewed the Jewish people as rejected and cursed by God, as cast out, having to wander forever, sometimes even portraying them as in league with the devil, as responsible for all terrible things going around. To have seen people as rejected, and now to see it as a dearly beloved elder brother of the church, of the original covenant, never broken and never to be broken. These are the words of John Paul II, reiterated by Pope Benedict XVI and by Pope Francis, who has said you cannot be a Christian and be an anti-Semite. John Paul II called anti-Semitism a sin against God and man. To see that, as now Cardinal Koch has said, an intrinsic relationship of special love and responsibility, to have gone from such negativity to such positivity is absolutely dramatic. And it is amazing that people do not know more about it, because it is so remarkable. There is nothing comparable in human history. And if anything should reassure Jews, particularly in difficult times, it should be Nostra Aetate. There is nothing that cannot be transformed from the bad to the good. Every relationship is redeemable. And Nostra Aetate is a symbol of that amazing transformation. So first of all, Nostra Aetate should be important for Jews because it shows the power of the good, of the godly, of being able to transform the bad into the good. Therefore, it is of religious significance, should be for Jews and everybody. But also, there are 1.2 billion Catholics in the world. That's not a little number. The Pew Foundation indicates that 85% of the world defines itself in religious terms. Maybe not so much in Western Europe, but the most of the world. And there are 2.2 billion Christians generally who are significantly influenced also by the Catholic world. That's of enormous tactical, if not strategic, significance for the Jewish people. So not to embrace this and not to engage with the Catholic world as positive friends is irresponsible from a Jewish point of view. It's worse than irresponsible. It is sakanat nefashot. It is to put us in danger instead of be able to secure the people. In addition, there are values we share, fundamental values. The sense of the divine in the world, the sanctity of the human being, the importance of the family, of community. If you believe in these principles and principles of justice and righteousness and peace, and you do not work with those who share them, then you are betraying those values. We have a responsibility to be greater than the sum of our different parts. And last but not least, it's not only how the Catholics see us, it's also what, as your question implies, we do. The highest Jewish principle is the principle of Kiddush Hashem. Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying God's name, does not just mean what you die for. Above all, as Rambam indicates, it means what you live for. and how you show the beauty of our heritage. In engaging with our Catholic brothers and sisters, it is our responsibility, through this special relationship, to show the beauty of our heritage. It's Kiddush Hashem, it's something that every Jew should feel obliged to be engaged in.
Rabbi, I'm listening to you and you're depicting a very positive, some would say a rosy picture.
A Rosen picture.
A Rosen picture. But as Herbert Winter just said before, we are going through some rough times lately. Anti-Semitism in Europe is raising its ugly head again. Jews are being victimized again in Europe in the recent Islamistic terrorist attacks in Paris and Copenhagen. And also in the general population in Europe, we witness an increase of hatred directed to the Jews as expressed. We heard it before on Facebook and on other internet platforms, and sometimes by physical attacks on Jews. The entrance to the synagogue, to the Jewish institutions, sometimes look more like security facilities than like synagogues. So many Jews are asking themselves, if every problem that comes up in Israel brings to an eruption of all those anti-Semitic repressed cliches, if this is the fruit of the interreligious dialogue, maybe we would be better without it.
Well, with all due respect, that's a very simplistic conclusion that anyone might make, and I don't think is very difficult to repudiate. I want it to be clear. In my words, it's true I spoke very passionately about the importance of this relationship and of the dialogue, and about the remarkable transformation. But I also acknowledge precisely that there are all the challenges and the problems we face. That's precisely the reason why we have to work together. It's of enormous strategic importance for us to do so. Now, you know the difference between the optimist and the pessimist. But why does the optimist see the glass half full? And why does the pessimist see it as half empty? The pessimist is the unrealistic one. He comes from on top and he expects to see a full glass, and therefore he sees everything that's missing. He says, oy vey, it's terrible, all this is missing, how awful, how terrible. The optimist comes from underneath. He knows the glass was originally empty, and therefore he sees every drop in it and he can celebrate it. Anybody with any sense of historical perspective who knows what it was like just 50 years ago, 70 years ago, especially for the Jewish people, how can you compare the situation today to what it was like 70 years ago? Yes, of course there are problems of Europe. There are all the issues that Dr. Winter and others refer to that we have to fight against today. But today virtually every single major European leader and opposition leader condemns anti-Semitism. That's an amazing transformation. It's one we have to work at. It's one we have to be involved in. It's one we must not rest on our laurels. But it's a totally different world. And to suggest that it's anything like it was for the Jews is just historical ignorance. There are real problems today. And as Dr. Winter said in his presentation, we have to work with all enlightened forces, with the Catholic Church, with the moderate Muslims. That's why interreligious engagement is so important. It's a strategic necessity. As I said, it's in mamash dinei nefashot. It's a matter of our life and of our protection. And I'm not suggesting everything is hunky-dory, and human nature can be very disappointing. There are lots of things. But it is also, there are if I may just conclude with a cliche. We can either curse the darkness, or we can light a candle. And interreligious engagement is lighting candles, and each and every one of us can make the world a brighter place.
Thank you. Well, since you're taking such a positive attitude, it's my job to be more critical. And Cardinal Koch, I want to ask you, anti-Semitism was clearly denounced by Nostra Aetate and by all the post-concilian popes. But anti-Semitism takes different and sometimes subtle forms, and sometimes we find it in disguise, especially now in our days. It seems to me that an important form of modern anti-Semitism in Europe shows in the battle of some people against circumcision and against the availability of kosher meat in Europe, against the shchita. This feels like a tragic déjà vu. As you know, every Jewish child knows about Antiochus Epiphanes, who 2,000 years ago forbade the Jews to circumcise their children and tried to force them to eat unkosher food, a story we still commemorate on Hanukkah. Cardinal, does the Catholic Church see itself as an ally of the Jews in exposing these more subtle forms of anti-Semitism? And what is your position regarding the battles against circumcision and the shechita in Europe?
Thank you. I think it's important to say three things. First of all, the knowledge about other religions is very weak in our society. People doesn't know the matter, the content of other religions, and then had the impression this circumcision, this kosher meal is very strange. It's against humanity. In this sense, it's very important to deepen the knowledge about other religions. And in this sense, the interreligious dialogue is very important also for a better knowledge of the other church, of the other religion, the other faith. And the second problem is that we have some problems with the religious liberty in our societies. The religious liberty is not accepted as the fundamental basic of the human rights. We have other human rights, and the religious liberty is a little secondary. And this is the second problem, that I remember in the Soviet time, the Soviet regime has not permitted the baptism for Catholics because this is not good for the heels of the children. And this, we have other matter against the liberty of religion. And this is very important that, above all, the European government, the European states have a deepened knowledge and importance of the religious freedom. And then the third thing is the particular content of the Jewish identity. And I think, above all, the circumcision is a part of the Hebrew identity, of the religion. And when in the European societies the circumcision is not permitted, it will say clearly that the Jewish people had not place in the European society. And this is a catastrophe after 70 years after the Second World War and the Shoah that we have. And in this sense, the Catholic Church will support the Jewish society, the community, that they can live her identity, religious identity, in our European societies.
Thank you. You mentioned, Cardinal, the special bond between Christianity and Judaism. Nostra Aetate also postulates the validity of the covenant between God and the Jewish people. This touches also upon the question of mission and the missionaries, a concern to many Jews also in Israel. Does the Church believe that the Jews have their own way of salvation, and has the Church given up on the Judenmission, on the missionary work among the Jews?
Now you have asked the most difficult question that you can raise up. And I think that's a very important question for the future theological dialogue. The main question is how we can reconcile the conviction of faith shared by Christian and Jewish people, that the Old Covenant is valid, is definitive, with the Christian conviction of the novelty of the New Covenant in Jesus Christ. How we can reconcile the two convictions in a manner that that Jewish people and Christians have the impression we are taken in serious in our convictions. This is the most difficult question. But I must say, for the other questions, the Catholic Church doesn't have an organized mission against Jewish people. I think this is a matter of some evangelical tendencies in the Protestant world. The Catholic Church doesn't have a mission against the Jewish people, but on the other side it's very clear that also Christians give witness about on her proper particular faith against the Jewish people, as the Jewish people give witness against the Catholic.
Toward. Against suggests versus and not verso. So you mean in English you would say towards, not against.
Yes.
Well, but Cardinal, also within the Roman Catholic world, there are more traditional people who are opposed to this reconciliation or this opening with the Jews, like the Pius Brotherhood. To what extent has the spirit of Nostra Aetate been fully internalized in the Roman Catholic Church? In other words, I wonder, what are the chances, or are there any chances for a backslide of the official church to the more conservative anti-Judaic views?
Yes, I must clearly say that all popes after the Second Vatican Council work on the basis of Nostra Aetate and have a beautiful continuation in the magisterium of Nostra Aetate. Above all, just Paul VI, he has visited the Holy Land 1 year before the promulgation of Nostra Aetate, and I'm so convinced that his visit in Israel will have many consequences for the promulgation of Nostra Aetate. And then John Paul II was very engaged in the Jewish Christian Catholic dialogue. He has just in his youth many friendships with Jewish people and has perpetuated these friendships also during his papacy. And he has made many steps. He had visited the former concentration camp Auschwitz. In all the pastoral visits, he has visited some Jewish congregations, some Jewish communities, and he has visited for the first time the synagogue in Rome. And this was a very important event because the Jewish community exists in Rome long before that the Christian faith is coming to Rome. Also we have, and then Benedict XVI have many deepened theologically the issues of John Paul II, and now Pope Francis have very an open heart to the Jewish people, and his clear sentence is repeat always that we cannot be Christian and to be an anti-Semite. It's a very important question. But I think we have some problems, some fundamentalists also in the Catholic Church. They are against this declaration of Nostra Aetate. But this is a minority in the Catholic Church, and those that are against Nostra Aetate are also against the ecumenical dialogue, are against the declaration of religious liberty, and are against the collegiality between the bishops. Also fast the half of the Second Vatican Council they don't deny. No. But I must say this is a minority. My concern is the knowledge about Nostra Aetate in the different countries, in the different regions in the Catholic Church. We have very beautiful developments, I think above all in Switzerland. We have the dialogue, President Winter mentioned it, between the Reformed churches and the Catholic Church with the Jewish people. We have an important institute in Lucerne for the research of the relationship between the two religions. But we have other regions, they have need some developments in the learning and knowledges of Nostra Aetate. This is very clear.
I understand from your answer that you believe there's no way back.
No, there's no way back.
There's no way back.
No, it's a point. Nostra Aetate is a point of no return.
You mentioning the visit of the Pope, John Paul, in 1986 in the synagogue in Rome. As a matter of fact, I had the pleasure, my late father took me there for that weekend, and I was there at that time, and I remember very vividly how touched we all were. Rabbi, when will the chief rabbi of Israel come and visit?
The synagogue.
A synagogue.
That's a very good
Depends
question.
which one.
Yes, that's probably more difficult. There are some synagogues that we will take a long time for the chief rabbis to be able to visit. The chief rabbis have been to the Vatican, and that's already now, I think, 3 generations of chief rabbis of Israel. And one of the amazing things with regards to the chief rabbinate of Israel, there was also thanks to the initiatives taken by the church. I mean, I was honored to be part of the team that negotiated the establishment of diplomatic relations between the Vatican and Israel, and that paved the way for the visit of Pope John Paul II in the year 2000. At his initiative, he asked to meet with the chief rabbinate of Israel, with the council. And he met with them, and it was probably the first time most of them had ever met a Christian, let alone a prelate, let alone a pope. And at this meeting, Pope John Paul II said to them, there are these organizations that represent the Jewish people to us, but I want us to have our own bilateral commission. And the chief rabbinate of Israel doesn't have a commission for dialogue with other kinds of Jews. They never thought of having one for dialogue with another religion. But when a pope asks you, it's rather difficult to say no. So as a result, I like to say I am the beneficiary of other people's absence and others' ignorance sometimes, so I get the benefit. So they needed somebody who at least knows the difference between a Catholic and a Protestant, so I was therefore brought in. But the interesting thing is this commission of the Chief Rabbinate of Israel, supported by the Chief Rabbis, is chaired by Chief Rabbi Shal Yashuv Cohen of Haifa, and has a number of city rabbis in it. And many of those rabbis, it was the first encounter. And it was really interesting to see how their perceptions changed. And this was not just those rabbis, if I may add. The visit of John Paul II in the year 2000, as you were talking about the visit in the synagogue, but in the year 2000 when he visited Israel, it had a big impact on Israelis. We need to bear in mind that in Israel, most Jews have never met a modern Christian. Even when we travel abroad, we meet non-Jews as non-Jews, not as modern Christians. So our image of Christianity is overwhelmingly taken from the negative past. To see a pope at Yad Vashem in tearful solidarity with Jewish suffering, learning the stories of how he saved Jewish children during the Shoah, how afterwards when he was a bishop, he returned Jewish children who'd been taken in by Catholics and baptized against their will, he returned them back to Jewish parents. To see him at the Kotel putting there at the Western Wall the text of a repentance of liturgy that he had composed that had taken place 2 weeks earlier in St. Peter's, asking God's forgiveness for all the sins committed against the Jews down the ages, that blew people's minds in Israel. And it also enabled, I think, some of my colleagues who have a more insular background and education to begin to open up to an understanding that, as I'm now quoting from a declaration from this bilateral commission, which comes under Cardinal Koch's responsibility for the Vatican, and which Chief Rabbi Cohen chairs, in one of the statements says, we say to our peoples, we are no longer enemies, but partners in providing a vision for the world to live in mutual respect. So there, look, 2,000 years again, 2,000 years, not going to disappear in 50. 50 is only yesterday. We have just begun this process. Nostra Aetate is just the beginning of this transformation. But we have achieved a lot, and even within some of my more narrow-minded colleagues, significant understanding that we have entered into a new age.
Let me speak about those narrow-minded colleagues of yours. You're talking very enthusiastically about what the Christian side is doing, and it's very convincing, also for me personally. You are an Orthodox rabbi, and I think you are very unique, and I wonder where are your Orthodox colleagues? Of course, there are historical reasons why Jews have difficulties to overcome the difficult history of 2,000 years. But I don't think that explains the difficulty of religious people and Orthodox people. Sometimes I have the feeling the more religious a person is, the stronger the religious commitment, the narrower minded they are, the less ready for dialogue they are.
But this is not so difficult to understand. It's not only a question of the historical burden. The more deeply rooted somebody is within their identity, the less expansive tends to be their experience and their engagement. This is the great challenge. The challenge which, for me, was a challenge my late father, Rabbi Koppel-Rosen, embodied when he established Carmel College in England, which was the idea that you have both Rabbi Akiva and Plato in one. You can be rooted deeply within your roots and still be a citizen and culture of the world. But it's not easy. It's not easy, and therefore there's a tendency that those who are most universalists tend to be very shallow, without an identity to pass on. And those with a very deeply rooted identity tend very often to be very insular. This is perfectly understandable and logical. The challenge is we must not be satisfied with this. We have to be able to promote generations that are deeply rooted and are universal at the time. And there are more and more rabbis, even in Israel. Now we just had a meeting convened by the Neo-Catechumenal Way at their beautiful center, Domus Galilei, just above the Lake of Kinneret in Tveria, where we had 120 rabbis from around the world. The vast majority of those rabbis were Orthodox, including even certain Haredi rabbis. In fact, the miracle was that the Orthodox rabbis were there together with non-Orthodox rabbis. Only the Catholic Church could bring us together. We couldn't do it ourselves. But at any rate, at this meeting, there are lots and lots of rabbis, more than there were before. Not only the Rashi Yeshiva for Yeshivat Ma'aleh Gilboa, which perhaps is more obvious, rabbis like that. But other rabbis, there was one rabbi, may know he's the chief rabbi of Savion, Rabbi David Brodman, very articulate, expressing this deep passion of this newfound relationship. There's Rav Ratzon Arusi, he's the most important Teimani rabbi. These are all new. There are more. All I can say is this. There are more and more Orthodox rabbis each passing day who are engaged in this process. This is a gradual process. We have to be patient and understanding for these particular needs, but it is improving all the time.
It seems to me, especially for us as religious people, Teshuvah is such a central aspect. We believe that the Teshuvah is possible, that people can repent and can change their ways. And what you describe, what the Catholic Church has done, I would call it Teshuvah.
And Pope John Paul II used that precise word. He said, first of all, he said, the fact that anti-Semitism became so central in Catholic practice requires an act of teshuvah. He said that word. And in the document which came as under Cardinal Koch's predecessor's predecessor, Cardinal Cassidy, from the ILC, the Joint Jewish Catholic Liaison Committee, that term was also used. We are expressing teshuvah, repentance for that anti-Semitism. Let me just, with your permission, Gabi, just add something else. There are theological issues here. We mustn't run away from those. It's not that Catholics and Jews can now say there's nothing that distinguishes us. This was in your question earlier with regards to Cardinal Koch. And there are halachic debates about Christianity. But the amazing thing with my colleagues is that most of my Orthodox colleagues, they all know the Rambam. They do not know Rabbeinu Tam, they do not know the Ramban, they do not know Rabbi Yaakov Emden, they do not know the Be'er HaGoleh, the commentary, they don't even know Rabbi Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, all of whom say categorically against the Rambam in terms of their approach and understanding of Christianity. Why do they not know it? They do not know it not because they are ignoramuses. They do not know it because we do not know what we do not want to know. It has to do with our inclinations, and it has to do with how we feel. And if we do not feel genuinely accepted and respected, but we feel that they are trying to steal our soul, or even trying to denigrate us, then we react negatively. This takes a long time. Jewish healing is a process. We know that the wounds of our history are very recent. As our wounds heal, and as I say to my Christian brothers and sisters, as you show us genuine love, which means genuine respect, we will learn how to genuinely respect and to love you. And this is not my words. These are the words of the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, in his commentary, Ha'emek Davar, where he comments on Vayivku and Esav and Yaakov meet. He says, they both cried because they were both aroused in their compassion from one another. And so he says, V'chein ledorot, so it will be in future generations. Esav, who has been a metaphor for Christianity, because that came out of Rome and therefore an association with Esau, will recognize the true divine purpose of Jacob, and Jacob will respond with that compassion and recognize Esav, ki achinuhu, he is our brother. These are the words of the Netziv. And these are the words that are coming true in our times, and we are part of this process.
Maybe let's get a little deeper into the fears and anxieties. And this is a question I want to address to both of you. I think one of the fears, for sure on the Jewish side, maybe also on the Christian one, is that the boundaries between dialogue and some kind of mixture of religions, syncretism, that this boundary might not be clear enough. And I really wonder sometimes in my own encounters with Christians, I'm invited to pray together. Should we make a common prayer? Should we celebrate Hanukkah and Christmas together? Where are the boundaries? Where is the limit? Where does healthy dialogue stop and we get to syncretism? Cardinal, maybe.
Syncretism is when we don't see the differences there are between the two religions, but to have a better knowledge of the other. Religion is the basic for the dialogue. And I think also it's very important that we can invite and Jewish people to us and to see how Christians pray. Because the prayer is the most intimate expression of the religion. And I know in my studies in Lucerne, I was sometimes invited by Jewish family for celebrate the Shabbat. It's very, and by you in Jerusalem, it's very important. And it's not a mixture. I participate as Christian, but I can deepen my own faith because the Christian faith has its roots in the Old Testament. And this is for me very important that we doesn't separate the Old and the New Testament. We have today now tendencies also in Germany at the University of Berlin with this Professor Slenska. He said that the Old Testament doesn't be an intrinsic part of the Christian Bible. And this is a very, very difficult question. And to have the unity between the Old and the New Testament, we can learn from each another. We have, after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, we have two traditions. We have the Christian interpretation of the Bible, and we have the new rabbinic interpretation of the Bible. We have two different lectures, and when we can read and interpret the other with my own ways, I can deepen my faith. And I think a very deep interreligious dialogue, we must have fear from mixture between the religion. Mixture is always when we don't have a deep interreligious dialogue. Then we are on the surface of the religion and not in the roots of the faith. And in this sense, I don't have this fear.
If I understood right, you were invited on Shabbat at Rabbi Rosen's house. Would you also let yourself be invited for a Christmas evening in a Christian family?
I certainly would have no objection to be able to go and be at a table. The question, of course, is what I would eat and what I would be able to drink. That's not a simple matter, but nevertheless, these are issues which we can manage. We can negotiate these things. I agree entirely with Cardinal Koch that the danger of syncretism is when the identities are at the lowest common denominator. Where you have a real serious identity, then there is not the danger. You understand and you can explore what are the limits and what are the possibilities. It's interesting for me today that I don't encounter any of these dangers. And there are dangers, but I don't encounter, but I think, as I say, they can be negotiated. I don't encounter them with my Catholic brothers and sisters. I do encounter them with evangelicals. And the interesting thing is it's another kind of a problem, because within the evangelical fundamentalist community, there's a great love of Israel and a great support for Israel. And it's not as if today we can say, well, we don't need your support. We can't allow ourselves to be so dismissive of this.
But very often these are elements who only love us because they see us as serving their eschatological agenda of bringing about the second coming when we will all convert. In other words, they want to love us to death. Well, that is not so respectful to cooperate with that, and there I think we at least have to be honest. We have to have integrity and say, we want your support, but we are not party to this ideology. We do not support this particular approach, and especially anyone who sees us as part of their, if you like, vanguard to fight against the anti-Christian forces, in other words, mirror images of bin Laden, that this is a war, a clash of civilizations, and the Jews are serving different interests in this. This is terrible. And we must say, I don't know whether there will be peace in Israel. I don't know. I hope, I pray for peace, but I don't know. But we must, I believe, not work with anyone who on principle is committed to our avoidance of peace and therefore having to fight interminably and perpetually. So there I think there are more problems with clarifying with the evangelical community, but with regards with the Catholic community, I've always felt that my identities and my sensitivities are always respected.
Mm-hmm. Rabbi, let me try to push your limits even a little further. In my personal encounters, actually with Catholics and Protestants alike, when we get into more personal talks, sooner or later, the Gretchenfrage is being asked, the crucial question, so what do you think about Jesus?
Yes, of course.
And
that will always come up.
This always comes.
Yes, and sometimes, and why do you not accept Jesus as the Messiah?
Exactly. And what I would like to know is, to what extent is some new reconception of Jesus by us Jews as maybe a rabbi who could have been part of some kind of machloket, of some kind of discussion in the Beit Midrash 2,000 years ago.
But again, that's not new.
In what sense, in what way could we say to the Christians, yes, Jesus is a part of our people?
So I think these are things that are important to do, but within the Orthodox community you have to do it on the basis of those sources that are available. And because you can do it independently, but you will do it much more successfully if you will point to the sources. And this kind of approach that you are articulating is to be found already. It's to be found in the Ramban, who I referred to, in Nachmanides, in his approach. It's to be found I mentioned both Moshe Rifkesh, but perhaps most dramatically in Yaakov Emden, and I mentioned Rav Shimshon of Hirsch. Incidentally, I should have mentioned earlier also the Meiri, because both Rav Kook and Rav Herzog based themselves on the Meiri. So it's possible to do that. In fact, Rabbi Yaakov Emden is quite explicit about the fact that, and others before him, that we need to distinguish between how Christians perverted the message of Jesus and our view, therefore, of the historical individual. And of course, there have been great academics, and like Professor David Flusser, who have referred precisely to Jesus. He sees him as totally a loyal Jew, and other, the famous uncle of Amos Oz, what was it, Klausner, also in terms of his writing and other areas like that. Now, look, the important thing is how one views the text with regards to the New Testament. This is not a simple matter, this is a more complex matter, and there are debates within Christians as to what can be considered to be historically authentic, or what's done, therefore, understand it within the perspective of the times, and when there was already polemical arguments. But, one other source I didn't mention, Rebbe Eliyahu Soloveitchik. He was another son of Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. And he refers to the fact, and I think it might also be even in some of the earlier sources I mentioned, to the fact that Jesus is quoted saying that I did not come to abolish anything, but to fulfill. Now, Christians understand that way, but the simple meaning of fulfillment means in Hebrew, lekayem. Lekayem et mitzvot means I want to observe them. And therefore, and the areas where he was totally loyal and saw himself as a loyal son of Israel. The problem with us is now not what Jesus was, but how the name of Jesus has been used. That's more our problem. And until Jews are able to get over the trauma of how it was used, it's going to be very difficult to be able to address the question of how do we see him. But I have no problem whatsoever in saying to my Christian friends, I believe Jesus was a loyal Jew. I believe he saw that there were things wrong within the Jewish community, just like the great Nevi'ei Israel, the prophets of Israel, saw before. And when prophets criticized Jews, they didn't say they were not a Jew. They were doing so out of internal loyal commitment. And I believe that he wanted to be able to see a better Jewish community. And in fact, he himself says, I came back to the lost sheep of Israel. He saw himself as an internal reformer in that regard. If you ask me why I don't accept him as the Messiah, because I, like other Jews at the time, have an understanding of the era of the Messiah, of when there is not only an ingathering of the exiles, but an era of universal peace. Doesn't seem to have happened then. It hasn't happened yet. So I'm not sure that there's any reason why I should see things the way you're seeing. But obviously a Christian sees it from a point of view of faith. But that shouldn't be an issue on which we therefore are separated. After all, there are those within our Jewish community today who think that their rabbi was the Messiah, and who says he was Messiah even though he didn't deliver, and think he's going to come back again, and we don't say that we can't have any contact with him because they have that particular opinion. So these are opinions of which we therefore should be able to look at, we should be able to explore it, but we need to do it now within a self-confidence for all the problems that both the state of Israel has provided for us and the new era in which we live. Again, despite all the problems, we live in a new era where we can be ourselves and where we do not have any fear to say what we do believe and what we don't believe.
Well, the rabbi conveyed some interesting ideas about Jesus. I think I'm obliged to ask you if you would like to relate to the ideas we just heard.
I cannot say what a rabbi must say about Jesus. I can only say as Christian, I cannot understand Jesus without the roots in the Old Testament, in the Jewish tradition. And in this sense, we have not the same situation. My hope is that the Messiah, on whom Christians believe that he is coming, Jesus Christ, and the Messiah on whom the Jewish people hope, await it coming, is the same. That's my hope. But it's an eschatological hope. We cannot show it, we cannot demonstrate it, but I think the basic of all relations between Christians and Jews is this hope that we have in the last time, on the end of the time, we can see that we believe in the same Messiah.
Well, this is a fascinating subject. We are about to run out of time, and there are so many more things I wanted to ask. So just one more thing, or two more things. Cardinal, for most Jews in the world, also here in Switzerland, the bond with the state of Israel is a central aspect to their Jewish identity. And the Catholic Church had to go a long way until it recognized the state of Israel. As you know, the Torah emphasizes the bond between the people of Israel and the land of Israel. How do you relate to the biblical territorial promises in the context of modern Zionism and the state of Israel?
First of all, I must say we have a clear difference on the Roman Curia. I'm only responsible for the religious relations with the Jewish people. All political and other issues are in the Secretary of State. In this sense, I'm not authentic to say something. Because I will say two things. First of all, it's very clear also for us Christians that the promise of land and state is a part of the Jewish identity. And as Christians, we must recognize it. On the other hand, we have today a secular state in Israel with a secular government, and this government must also be criticized. And this difference, what happens with the concrete politics in Israel and the biblical promise of land, we cannot identify the two things, but we cannot separate the two things. And we must weigh a middle way, and this is not easy.
Also, Jewish theologists are having difficulties with this issue. But I have to ask both of you an important question, which is concerning everybody, I think, and that is also the interreligious dialogue with Islam, which is, I think, in quite a rudimentary stage compared to what is happening between the church and synagogue. And yet, what I would like to ask you, you've really described in what remarkable ways the Christian, the Catholic Church could overcome prejudices and also their behavior towards the Jewish people. What can we learn from this process for the chances of also improving the relationships between the Jewish people, the Israeli people, and the Muslims? I'm asking both of you.
I think both dialogues are not on the same level. We have in the Roman Curia two pontifical councils. Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue is engaged in all dialogues with other religions, with Muslims, with Buddhists, with Hindus. And we have the Pontifical Council for Promotion of Christian Unity, as the president. But the Commission for the Religious Relations is in the Pontifical Council for Promotion of Christian Unity and not in the Pontifical Council for Interreligious Dialogue. And this is a very important sign that our relations with the Muslim is not on the same level as our relations with the Jewish people. And I think today we speak about an Abrahamic ecumenism. And I think on the one hand this is true. On the other hand, in the Muslim religion, in Jewish religion, in Christian religion, we have a different vision, different view of Abraham. And we cannot deny these differences that we have. For me, it's very important that the three religions confess together that the sister of religion is peace, reconciliation, and justice, and not violence. We must have a clear witness, common witness of all religion against the abuse of religion in violence. And in this horrible situation that we have today in the new growing of anti-Semitism, and I cannot forget also a growing of anti-Christianism and persecution of Christianity, and we must help one another. I was very grateful and helpful that the President Lauder in the word has also said a clear word against the persecution of Christians in this world. And the most important what we must learn in interreligious dialogue is the clear witness against abuse of violence in the religion. And this was the most important issue and content of the three meetings in Assisi. Twice by John Paul II, once by Benedict XVI, that all Christian confessions and all religions are coming to Assisi and to confess that we are engaged in peace and justice and not in violence.
Thank you.
Very briefly, may I make a comment on the earlier matter you were discussing? In the preamble to the Fundamental Agreement, which is the document that was signed by the Vatican together with Israel, establishing bilateral relations, the preamble to the Fundamental Agreement recognizes that these relations are established in the context of the historic transformation of Catholic-Jewish relations. So that is, I think, just something to note. The relationship for Christians with Jews is obviously unique, because a Christian cannot understand herself or himself without reference to Jewish sources. But the relationship is also unique from a Jewish perspective, because if Christians affirm that the text that is our divine text is the divine text and affirm their commitment to it, then by definition, they are the agents of something which is crucial to our own identity. And therefore, how Christianity is perceived in the world should be also something of concern for us, because if they are not presenting it in a manner that's consonant with the moral principles of tenet, that is our Chilul Hashem too.
So we actually have a unique responsibility in relation to the Christian world. This would be my most dramatic comment for this evening. But at the same time, we seek to affirm that there is one divine force behind the world, guide and power, that is the source of godliness and goodness in the world. And in that we share it with other religions, most notably with Islam. And we have a responsibility to work together to make that, and especially in terms of those who've perverted, as we've already said this evening. These radical, extremist, violent perverters of Islam are a bigger threat to most Muslims than they are to Jews and Christians. They're a threat to us, yes, but first and foremost, they're a threat to most Muslims. And they cause them far more distress than they cause us. And we sometimes forget that. So we have to work together. This is our common task, to fight these aberrations, these distortions and perversions, and to be able to make our world a better place.
Thank you. I think that was a very interesting chiddush you just said, a new idea which I've never heard about the Chilul Hashem, something to think about later on. Our time is really up, and so I'm going to skip and go to the last question, which is really a personal one. One of the outcomes of dialogue is inevitably the evolution and change of one's own identity. There is no real dialogue without change of yourself. So on a personal note, I'd like to ask both of you to share with us something about the ways the other religion, for you, Rabbi, Christianity, and for you, Cardinal, Judaism, in what way these encounters have enriched your own faith and maybe also changed the way you understand your own religion.
Well, as we've already said this evening, I think for me personally, interfaith encounter has made me a better Jew. It certainly made me a more understanding Jew, because when you encounter the other and you have to explain yourself, then you have to study yourself far more seriously. You can't get away with selling lokshen as you might under circumstances. So you've got to work harder. So I think it's actually made me a better Jew and made me a more learned Jew. But it's also opened me up to another reality, which again might be some dramatic as the one I mentioned before. For some of my colleagues, it might be a little bit shocking. But that is that it is, I was already a rabbi in South Africa when I got involved in interfaith relations. And I got involved in interfaith relations not because I believed in it or was particularly interested in it in itself. I got involved in it because I was committed to social justice. And that was the period of apartheid. Apartheid was an evil system that was against fundamental Jewish teaching. It was therefore my responsibility as a rabbi in South Africa to try to do something about it, without automatically being thrown into jail or being kicked out of the country, as eventually I was. But nevertheless, to try to do something. So one way that you could do it was through religion, because generally speaking, the government was a bit nervous about touching religion. So I started working to build together, this was in the late 70s, mid-70s in Cape Town, an interfaith forum, Council of Christians, Muslims and Jews. And the encounter with the other for me was fascinating. First of all, I was stunned to discover how ignorant they were. How even Christians had such distorted perceptions about Judaism. I thought Christians would know what Judaism was. I was amazed. But the amazing thing, even greater, is when I reflected on it, I was amazingly ignorant about them, and I had all these prejudices and stereotypes and simplistic notions. And therefore, it was important for me to be able to educate myself. But then there was something else that was a bit of an epiphany for me at that moment. I realized here we talk about an omnipresent deity, and yet, often we try to encapsulate the totality of that divine within our own tradition, as if somehow one religion can encapsulate the totality of God. That's ludicrous. God is more than any one religion. And I can never know the entirety. I can only get a glimpse of the divine. And Judaism teaches that when we meet the other human person, we are meeting one created in the image of God.
And therefore, a true human encounter is a divine encounter. How much more so when that is an encounter where the person has a sense of the divine in his or her own religion. And therefore, a religious engagement was, in fact, and is for me, an engagement with the greater presence of the divine in the world. It should not change my loyalties. In fact, I don't think the opposite is the case. I think I'm a more loyal Jew. But it has made me aware of the divine presence beyond my own context as a Jew. And that is enormously enriching.
Thank you. Cardinal.
In the Christian-Jewish dialogue, I have learned better my own faith. Above all, the New Testament, to read the New Testament on the background of the Old Testament tradition, of the Jewish tradition. I think that the most beautiful book on Jesus by Pope Benedict XVI is very appreciated by Jewish people. He has very beautifully shown that many sentences of Jesus are not to be understood without the feast in the Jewish tradition. And I have many learned about the liturgy in the Catholic Church, because the Catholic liturgy is very rooted in the Jewish liturgy. We have a clear relation between the Eucharistia and the Beracha. And to deepen all these realities from the Jewish tradition is very important for the Christianity. And in this sense, I say, we don't change the identity. We have not a closed identity, we have an open identity, open for the other religion and open for the enrichment that we can receive from the other religion. And this, in this sense, in the dialogue between Christian and Jewish, I become more Christian.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Or a better Christian, I hope.
Dear friends, 1965, the year of Nostra Aetate, was the year that Martin Buber passed away. I'm thinking of him because, as you know, Buber's thinking was founded on dialogue, on the dialogical principle. In his Ich und Du, Buber stated, der Mensch wird am Du zum Ich. Through the thou, a person becomes I. Our conversation this evening, dear Cardinal Koch, dear Rabbi Rosen, our conversation seems to be, to me, as an inspiring illustration of the constitutional vigor of dialogue between individuals and between cultures and religions. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cardinal Koch. Gabi Strenger. I think I'm not exaggerating if I'm saying it's the most inspiring trialogue about dialogue I have heard before. Thank you very much, and a small present from us for you. Please.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.